Alright guys, so today I'm going to be going over NSAIDs and how they can impact musculoskeletal gains. Before we go into it, we're going to go over a quick overview. So what are NSAIDs? What do they do? Quick physiology on how they could potentially impact that process of when you have a musculoskeletal injury, and then how do they go about that process? And then the significance of NSAIDs on musculoskeletal gains. So NSAIDs are anti-inflammatory in nature, meaning they are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. They have an anti-inflammatory effect on the peripheral tissue, and they're commonly used in athletic populations. So I'm guilty as charged. When I played sports when I was younger, I played baseball. We would have tournaments that would last Thursday through generally Sunday, and basically my throwing arm, by the time I got to Sunday, that thing was wrecked. So I was popping NSAIDs like Skittles, trying to make sure I can continue to keep my ability to throw at the same capacity that I did on Thursday. And right now the literature seems to be a little ambiguous regarding musculoskeletal growth. So we're going to build a case for that throughout the rest of the presentation. So what do NSAIDs do? They have an analgesic effect, which is also known as pain reducing or reduction of pain, and we'll go into that next. And they also have an antipyretic effect. So that's a reduction in basically if you have a fever, so through thermoreceptors. And then there's decreased prostaglandin release as well, which is the inflammatory response to injury. So they decrease prostaglandin release. So what's the process of strength training, and how does this mechanism of NSAIDs impact musculoskeletal growth? So there is generally a response to injury. So for instance, I'm in a bicep training study right now. We're inducing, I would say, at least Rio, would you agree that it's probably inducing some sort of local injury to the muscle, yeah? No? Well, then I am in the select few because I feel sore after. So, but we have a local response to injury. With that injury, we have an afferent signal that is sent out to the brain. Then we have an efferent signal that responds. The brain goes, okay, there's probably an injury here, and sends an efferent signal back to the site. So for instance, my biceps. Arachidonic acid is released in response to that to get back to homeostasis. Arachidonic acid is then broken down, which again is released from the phospholipid bilayer by cyclooxygenase 1 and 2 enzymes. Enzymes, as we know earlier, they help break something down into another product, and those products are prostaglandins. So, prostaglandins, we'll go over that for the inflammatory response at the end, but basically NSAIDs inhibit these cyclooxygenase enzymes. They don't allow them to necessarily produce at such a high level as when we have that musculoskeletal injury. So what does that do? It inhibits prostaglandin release, which then has that decreased inflammatory response, which is the nociception side effect. So you'll have decreased pain because of the decreased inflammation. So what's the significance of an NSAID? NSAIDs can impact musculoskeletal growth via decreased prostaglandin release in the prostaglandin factor 2 alpha specifically. And the reason why is because that's our inflammatory mechanism. We have another prostaglandin release that is also associated with mucosal in like the, if I'm not mistaken, in the gut and like the kidneys, but that's not necessary for musculoskeletal growth. But unfortunately, it's more nuanced than we initially thought. It makes sense mechanistically. But what is the significance in the literature? So we have quite a few studies basically going from left to right. Most of the NSAIDs that are out there are inhibitors of both COX-1 and COX-2, or cyclooxygenase 1 and 2 enzymes. But we have one specifically that is a COX-2 inhibitor that's considered Celebrex. As we can see, not going into each one, most of these were resistance training studies, but they weren't ideal. They weren't super structured studies that we're kind of used to running here, where we have 6 to 8 weeks, full resistance training program, the whole 9. These were very specific. For instance, this one was knee kicking, and as you can see why, the age group is there as well. But specifically, the reason why I want to go over this slide here is we have two groups that are 50 plus years old. In those 50 plus year old groups, we had decreased in what we considered those prostaglandins, which makes sense because they're inhibitors. But we had a decrease, or I'm sorry, no change in muscle CSA and a DEXA scan. In this one, we had increased muscle protein synthesis. But the other studies show no change or a decrease in younger groups. That's interesting because in older groups, we kind of know that there's increased cytokines, increased prostaglandin release, inflammatory markers in the elderly. So maybe decreasing those with continual use in the elderly, you're going to have potentially more favorable adaptations with musculoskeletal training. Because if you have chronic inflammation, we get it down, you might have a more positive inflammatory response to the actual resistance training. But as you can see, again, there's really no changes or decreases in muscle growth with NSAID supplementation. There's my references, but what do you guys think? I wanted to really kind of leave this open for discussion because mechanistically it makes sense. But the literature I read in the youth, not a huge change, maybe some impact in older demographics. So open for questions or just interpretations. What do you guys think?
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and like.